Who's going to save Obamacare this time? Chief Justice John Roberts or Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell? Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, the Trump administration filed a brief in a case called California versus Texas, which is essentially a group of red states and a group of blue states, as they call them, debating over whether or not the Affordable Care Act, so-called Obamacare, should be stricken from the books because since the last Supreme Court decision, Congress has decided to remove the so-called penalty from individuals who don't have coverage, and therefore what John Roberts called in his initial decision a tax, which Congress does have the power to do, has been stricken, and the whole thing should collapse under its weight, according to the red state case. And Bill, I guess it's been so long that I just have a hard time imagining that either A, Chief Justice John Roberts or someone else on the Supreme Court won't find another reason to save the Affordable Care Act, or B, Republicans in the Senate will realize that their electoral prospects are hindered by striking it down during an election year. What do you think?
Well, they might be hindered by not striking it down during an election year. While you were asking the question, I was thinking about the Tea Party movement, which got started as a direct result of this, and I was a little shocked because it seemed like, oh, that must have been 5-6 years ago, 11 years ago. It was in 2009, as I recall.
Yes.
And so, needless to say, as somebody who's spoken at hundreds of Tea Party events and been doing shows with you and Steve and so on for about that longer even. The Affordable Care Act is one of the things that I find the most challenging to the entire idea of government and private sector and so on and so on and so on. I preface all this to say only that, and we've discussed this before, you cannot burn down a structure that has people in it until you got another structure to move them into first. And the failure of the Republicans to present the alternative to Obamacare, which is to basically not tweak and not adjust or rebalance, but to simply just go in and cut this horrendous Gordian knot, probably an aneurysm is a better word in this particular case, that exists between the individual, which pays money, which goes to the government, which pays money that goes to the insurance company, which pays money that goes to the doctor, who pays money so that he has personnel who can deal with both the insurance company and the government and the patient. And why don't we just get rid of all of that mess and just go back to paying the doctor the way that we used to? And we've also discussed the idea that certain states, I recall Georgia, are looking into this kind of thing, and we're seeing the rise of what's been called concierge medicine, where basically some doctors decide that they'd rather be doctors in the traditional sense, have their own business and hang out a shingle and have their own patients and so on. And they charge their patients some monthly amount, $200 or whatever, and then they treat them for anything up to his ability to treat. And this is becoming extremely popular, and it's becoming popular because it is inexpensive for the patient, it's inexpensive for the doctor, and it is basically getting rid of this giant jungle that has to be hacked through every time you go to a doctor for a sore throat.
Well, Bill, there's this weird kind of house of cards stack, and let me just review it. Many of our viewers already know this, but I remember the last time when we were talking about the court decision, I believe it was NFIB versus Sebelius, where Chief John Roberts essentially rescued Congress from their own incompetence by saying that something that they had called a penalty was actually a tax, and therefore it's okay because Congress has the power to levy taxes. So basically it goes like this. Insurance companies must issue insurance to anybody now under this. But that only works if everybody has to be in the pool, because the actuarial tables will be really screwed up if you don't get everybody in the pool. So the guaranteed issue is supported by the individual mandate. Well, individual mandate with no teeth in it wouldn't actually be an individual mandate because people just would do what they want. So you have to have a penalty in order to make sure that people comply with the individual mandate. But Congress doesn't have the power to regulate the insurance industry to that extent of invoking penalties for failure to buy insurance. And so we need to call it a tax, which was the John Roberts rescue the last time around. It is hard for me to get my head around something that would now allow Roberts to say, well, actually, there were other really good reasons to maintain the constitutionality of this. Forget that whole thing I said about penalty and tax. Do you think that the Supreme Court upholds the lower court ruling, which is basically the ACA is now unconstitutional?
I don't know about that, Scott, but I will tell you this. I remember that particular aspect of it. I remember Chief Justice Roberts making that ruling, and basically, just for those of you who are not in on, don't have your program open in front of you here, Obamacare was challenged on the grounds that on a number of grounds, it was unconstitutional, that it was forcing you to buy something, and that's what what did they call it? I'm sorry, the fee or penalty, a penalty, right?
It was a penalty at first, yes.
Right. So Roberts basically said, no, that's not constitutional. It's a tax. But as you said, paraphrasing Roberts, it's okay for Congress because Congress can raise taxes.
Even while the debate in Congress said clearly it is not a tax, it's a penalty because Congress didn't want to pass a tax.
This is the point. This is the point. If it had been called a tax, which is what it was, it never would have passed. And Chief Justice Roberts absolutely either, depending on how you want to look at it, overstepped his authority or failed to do his job. What he should have done is said, no, this is a tax. You sold it as a penalty, but it's not a penalty. It's illegal if it's a penalty. It's legal if it's a tax. Strike the law, send it back to the legislature, and have them pass it as a tax. And that's what he should have done, and that's obviously not what he did.
Well, in effect, Bill, at the time, I made just that argument that you could read the Roberts ruling as saying, look, this isn't a matter for the court, it's a matter for the legislature. As it is, it's unacceptable, but tosses it back to Congress and says, look, you've got to call it a tax if it's a tax. But Congress didn't take the bait.
Well, it's not a question of taking the bait. You want to talk about an action that has no teeth to it. If the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court with the majority ruling basically says, Congress, this is unconstitutional, the way you pass is unconstitutional, you need to fix it. And Congress goes, or what? This is why it had to be stricken and then be fixed, but that's not what happened. And it's pointless to argue about this now. It's so far deep in the past. Now, if you talk about Obamacare without the tax or the penalty, depending on how you want to call it, now you have to ask yourself, well, what's really left? You really did hit the nail on the head in terms of the fundamental problem with the whole idea of health insurance as it exists today. And that problem is simply this. If you are healthy or young, or if you're ready to take a chance, there's no reason to buy health insurance. Prior to Obamacare, if you didn't buy health insurance, you couldn't get it once you did. You can't go down and find, oh my God, I've got cancer now, I'm going to get some insurance. It just doesn't work that way, because the only reason the insurance company, as you said, can pay for the cancer treatment for the person who has cancer is because there are tens or hundreds of other people paying who don't have cancer or any other reason to really be drawing down on that fund. And that's how insurance works. That's just how it works. Now, I personally believe that the idea of being declined medical coverage because of a pre-existing condition is a fatal problem with the system as that existed. I think that's a fatal problem. But how else do you get around the cheater thing? And I, honest to God, don't know the answer to that. But I will tell you this: the answer is not in more government, and it's not in more power to the insurance companies. And what we're seeing more and more, and I'm hearing this from more and more doctors out there, more and more doctors not only retiring early, but more and more people who are drawn to the medical profession have decided that rather than undergo the incredible cost of medical malpractice and just the plain raw hassle of basically being a doctor as a private corporation who treats patients, more and more and more people who are actual doctors, medical doctors, are simply becoming employees of various gigantic health centers and medical centers. And they basically have given up their ability to run themselves as a separate business. They go in, they sign in, they work from 8 to 4 or whatever. Then they sign out, then that patient isn't their problem anymore. And that's bad too. The thing, Scott, is this thing cannot be tweaked, and it can't, and furthermore, it can't be simply abolished and leave nothing in its place. The failure, as I said, of the Republicans to produce an alternative is, we have got, let's just face the facts. This thing still exists because of Republicans. It still exists because of Republicans. They didn't create it, but they've had innumerable opportunities to overturn it. And let's just go through the litany real quick. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected. 2009, Nancy Pelosi uses all sorts of, just weird tricks like we will deemed it to have passed and so on, crams it down the throat of the American people with one vote, not a single Republican. That's 2009. The American people become so enraged by this. In 2010, they flip the House and give the House to Republicans. Republicans then say, we're running to appeal this, repeal it. So they take the House in 2010. 2012, Romney loses. 2014, the Republicans get the House and the Senate. And then in 2016, they get the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And finally, you have the ability to end this thing. And then the Republicans in the legislature, not Donald Trump, in the legislature just suddenly start doing this. Well, if we do this, this might make us unpopular at home. You were sent there to do this. The only thing that just is so fundamental to this thing. And I don't know why this is not the central issue, because it's the central issue. What are you going to put in its place? Are you going to put another gigantic government program in its place and just call it something different? That's not going to change anything. You've got to go to the fundamental, absolute base problem, which is because the dollar comes from my pocket, goes to Washington, they take 33 cents. These numbers are accurate, by the way. They send that dollar to the insurance company, they take 34 cents. They send the remaining 33 cents, 32 cents to the doctor, who then has to pay 10 cents on the dollar maybe to hire staff to deal with the insurance company and the government. Why don't we just give the dollar to the doctor? And then we don't have to worry about insurance billing us $20 for an individual aspirin tablet. If we're not willing to get to these foundational problems, then we're not going to get a solution. And the solution is actually pretty simple. And the solution is, let the free market handle it the way it's handled everything else. The market drives down cost, drives up choice, and simply is an ongoing, never-ending defender of the public, because it is the public. The market is people making decisions. And as I like to say, I don't know why the Democratic Party thinks so much more highly of cars than they do for people, but I have, under Obamacare, with 3 choices. My car has hundreds of choices. My car can decide if it wants full coverage, minor coverage, minimum legal coverage. My car can decide any number of things. And there are hundreds of companies lining up to get my car's business. And they're competing against each other to drive the costs down. And we simply won't do this for healthcare. And I don't understand why, but that is one thing that could happen immediately, is that the legislature, the national legislature, could simply remove these healthcare restrictions and allow healthcare companies to compete across state lines and sell health insurance the way they sell car insurance. And if they were to do that, our problems would be over.
Final question, Bill. Whether the Republicans in the Senate decide to do anything about this or not, it will certainly be a campaign issue. The Supreme Court is slated to hear this case, California versus Texas, in the fall term. And so questions are going to come up on the campaign trail. If the Supreme Court were to strike down the Affordable Care Act, what is the plan of Republicans? Joe Biden and other Democrats are out there right now saying that the day that the Supreme Court strikes that down, 23 million people will be without health care. Some of the language is even more strident than that. Bill, how do you think Republicans hold up during a campaign season when it is more crucial than ever that they do well in the Senate races in the face of this kind of tide of questions about whether your kids or grandkids are going to have insurance?
I just want to preface what I'm about to say by saying I've been fighting Obamacare for 11 years now. But you do have to ask the question, and the question is a legitimate question that people have a right to ask. If you are going to strike this down, what is left? What's in its place? And this idea that we can just run against Obamacare without an alternative is madness. And there's not a lot of time left. It's not like all of a sudden they can. I just don't understand this one. Well, I'm sure I do. There's reasons why politicians won't make changes like this, because there's an awful lot of money involved. But nevertheless, the solution is very simple. The legislation is relatively simple. Eliminate the restrictions on healthcare as it exists today. Eliminate them. Make it a competitive item that can be sold across state lines and so on. And anybody who's got the financial resources to set up an insurance company sets one up. And they won't do it. And so to answer your question directly, it is an enormous vulnerability, and it is a real vulnerability, and it is an own goal kind of an error that goes to a bigger issue than politics. Really, when I say a bigger issue than politics, this is bigger than Republicans versus Democrats. Now we're talking about people versus the system. We're talking about the ability to really drastically reform an entire sector of the industry, which, as we all remember from the Tea Party days, is a sixth of the economy. If you were to get the government and insurance companies out of the way and let the insurance companies have to compete against each other, then the insurance companies are going to have to work harder. They're going to have to provide more service for less money. The government won't have anything to do. That's exactly how it should be. But no one's talking about this. So if we get pasted on this issue, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And when the solution is so obvious and so simple and so sellable, give the dollar to the doctor instead of sending the dollar all the way around town and having it end up with a dime. This is such a simple sell that I don't understand why no one's getting in front of it. And my hope would be that since the system is so tied into this huge ocean of money, that Donald Trump himself will pick up this torch and carry this torch into his second term and make that the equivalent of the wall, right? Not that I'm going to provide health care for every single American. Make it, I am going to change restrictive legislation that has been in place since the Roosevelt administration, designed to freeze wages and tie it to your job. I would do a quick little 30-second thumbnail on how we got into this mess and say, I'm just simply going to get rid of this. It's a service, and it's going to be provided as a service. And in a year, you will see the results of this. And if he doesn't do it, I don't know who will.
Well, it is somewhat peculiar for presidential administration and the Justice Department to not to defend a federal law. Typically, the Justice Department does defend federal laws. In this case, they've filed a brief on behalf of the red states that are trying to strike down the federal law. We'll see where this goes in the fall, in the Supreme Court session, and throughout the campaign right here on Bill Whittle Now. This program is made possible by the contributions of our members. If you'd like to join them, go to BillWhittle.com and click the big green Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.